Hi guys, Darrel Smith from South Dakota. I've been trying to tell a few stories that were that I've lived in my life. I started out by trying to tell stories of my flight training as a U.S. Marine, a Marine aviator. It was a demanding time, but I wanted to share that experience with you. My training had gone well. My initial training was in Pensacola, then they sent us to Marine, to Meridian, Mississippi for our jet training, initial jet training. And once that were successful and completed, we were sent back to Pensacola for a big step in naval aviation. In those days, it was required that every naval aviator make carrier landings to qualify on the aircraft carrier. So this short period of training, although was short, was very intense in that we were going to take an aircraft and attempt to land on a carrier and also use it in gunnery. It was the first experience at air-to-air gunnery. My training had gone pretty well, and we came back to Pensacola and found a small trailer house, and we weren't going to be there very long, so we weren't looking for anything special, but it was an old trailer and very, very small. At this time, a thought began to creep into the back of my mind. Until this time, we had been learning to fly the aircraft. We would go out, pre-flight it, taxi out, take off, climb to altitude, do some altitude work, come back to the field and do practice landings and then land. But gradually they had been working us into the thought of using the airplane for what it was designed for, and that was as a weapon. So aircraft landings and gunnery was the first step. We, they called it FCLP, field landing, carrier landing practice. They had taken a runway on an auxiliary airfield and painted the end of it to look exactly like an aircraft carrier deck. And a LSO, a landing signal officer, would be stationed at the end of the runway, and it had the approach light system as the carrier would have. So we'd go out day after day and practice many times these simulated carrier approaches and landing. We usually flew several approaches, then landed the aircraft and walked to a kind of an old shack, and it was the furniture in it was old and worn out. It was old couches and old worn out chairs, and we would sit in that room, and the LSO, landing city officer, would come in and go over every one of our approaches. They had taken careful notes, and they would give us what we had done wrong or right, and probably the probability of catching a wire on the carrier. Well, this went on for several weeks, and it was actually boring after a while, but it was good training. The other part of training was the gunnery. I don't know if I can explain this very well or not, but there would be an aircraft takeoff towing a banner. He'd go out over the Gulf of Mexico and stay at one altitude and one airspeed. And a 4-plane flight would launch after the banner flight had departed, and we could catch up with it because he wasn't going too fast, and we'd go into a gunnery pattern. And this would be difficult to explain, but each aircraft would assume a perch position, they called it, and that was even with the banner aircraft, and off to the side, and about maybe 3,000 feet above. And the banner would go one speed straight ahead. The aircraft on the perch would roll in and dive toward the banner. And then by this time, the banner had moved forward, and then we could reverse or turn to the right hard and go zooming by the banner, and then by the aircraft, the tow aircraft that was towing the banner. We would be going pretty darn fast at that time, and we would press in, and we had 50 caliber machine guns mounted on our aircraft, and our goal was to put some holes in that banner. Well, I can tell you that as hard as I tried, I didn't damage that banner at all. Thank goodness it wasn't required to get hits in order to qualify or get through the program. So as we zoom by the tow aircraft, then we pull across in front of him and zoom back up to the perch position and do it over and over again until we ran out of ammunition. So we were using I don't know if I said this before, but we were gradually learning to use the aircraft as a weapon. Well, in flight training, the initial flight training, ground school, we would run along the seawall to maintain our physical conditioning. The aircraft carrier was tied up at the Naval Air Station, and we had run alongside of it on the shore. It was a big machine, and in the back of our heads, we knew that at some point, if we were successful in the program, that we would approach that machine in an aircraft and attempt to make arrested landings. The Navy and Marine Corps flight training programs are the same. Tried to keep the family members of the pilots involved. So Glenda was invited to go to sea on the aircraft carrier to watch the operation. She was not allowed to go on the day that I was to fly. So she does remember, I quizzed her, and she does remember going on the flight. She doesn't remember much of watching the aircraft. She doesn't remember what she had for lunch, but she is aware that she was there. I have never been to sea on a naval ship. She has. Well, the big day finally arrived, and with all our practice, we were full of confidence. A 4-plane was launched, and I was part of that 4-plane flight, and we joined up and headed out over the Gulf of Mexico. I don't know how far out, maybe 20 miles. We could see the ship, the aircraft carrier. I just remember the view of Pensacola area and the Gulf of Mexico as we were departing was exceptional. It was early in the morning, and it was beautiful. Well, this 4-plane approached the aircraft carrier in the direction that it was traveling, so we came from behind. And as we got overhead, individually, we would make a hard turn to the left away from the flight. And each flight would, after an interval, each pilot, after an interval, would make that hard turn, and that would get us in the position to be lined up, one behind the other, with space between us for our approaches to the ship. We slowed, and dropped our landing gear and flaps, but we did not drop the resting hook. So we were going to make some approaches to the ship without trying to catch a wire. We did this several times, and when the LSO, who was standing, the same guy that worked with us on the practice field, was standing on the back of the ship, and he watched us. He evaluated how we were responding to his instructions and how we were flying the aircraft, and individually he told us to drop the hook. So these, by the way, these I lost the word, LSO seemed to be almost superhuman to me. I remember one time after I dropped the hook, I was lined up with the ship and on speed, on glide slope, on airspeed, and everything looked good to me. And this guy quietly said, "You're gonna need a little power." And I was on, like I said, I was right on. And in my mind, I didn't say it on the air, but on my mind I said, "Bullshit, I'm good." But almost immediately the aircraft started to settle, and a little bit of power was required to get me on glide slope again. I was told to drop the hook. I came around and did all the same procedures, and our instructions were, or we'd been trained to, as the aircraft landing gear hit the deck, we put to full power, and in the anticipation of flying again if we didn't catch a wire. Well, all at once, I was looking at a crewman on the ship, and I had my power at full power, and he's looking at me saying, reduce your power, and not verbally, hand signals. And so I did that, and he turned me over to a taxi director. They eventually put a tow bar or a steering bar in my landing gear nose wheel, and so the only power I had was power on, power off. I had my brakes. I could do that. Well, I was guided across the deck, and a blast fence was in front of me. This is a device that comes up behind an aircraft that is being launched to deflect the exhaust thrust away from the aircraft behind him. Well, the blast fence disappeared. I was directed onto the carrier, onto the catapult, and there was they finally pointed to this guy off to the side. I later learned that he's called the shooter, and he's responsible for the entire operation of a caterpillar shot, so catapult shot. And they, all at once, something really strong had my aircraft. I could tell it pulled the struts almost flat. And the shooter was looking at me, and he was giving me the signal to run up the engine to full power. Oh man, it happened so fast. I put it at full power, and the only thing I could remember, I was supposed to look at all my gauges to make sure the engines were running properly. But it was like everything was a blur. The only thing I could remember was to look at him and give him a salute. I put my head against the headrest, and there was tremendous noise, power, and acceleration, and suddenly I was over water again, flying. I had just made my first catapult, my first arrested landing and catapult takeoff. Well, I did what was required that day, and I qualified as a carrier pilot. I did that only twice during my career. Most of my flying was off of fixed base. Both days when I qualified, the weather was nice, the sun was shining, and the seas were pretty flat. I admire and I do not envy the Marine and Navy pilots that flew during pitching decks and at night. You got to hand it to them. And, they did it, and they did it right, but they never bragged. Glenda and I it was only a month or two there in Pensacola, but one of the nights just as before we were to leave, there was a strange noise that we hadn't heard before, and we opened the door and looked outside, and in Pensacola, which is a very unusual thing to happen, there was ice pellets that had covered the whole yard out there. It's very unusual weather for them. So I was successful in gunnery and carrier quals, and my next step was go to the Advanced Jet Training Command in Texas, and I was in Kingsville. I was assigned to Kingsville, Texas. I don't know, maybe I just don't know what I'm talking about, but I believe even today, with a little bit of practice, I could make an approach and landing in a Boeing 747. I may be kidding myself, but if this ever happened, it would have to be sure to consider my nap time in the afternoon. Thank you very much. That's my story for today.